By the time children reach the age of 2 or 3, their empathic skills are more fully developed. They now understand that different things can distress different people and that different actions are needed to alleviate this distress. Furthermore, because they now have the tool of language at their disposal, they can understand rather complex feelings in others, such as disappointment, sadness over something lost, and even feeling bad about oneself, i.e., low self-esteem. The final stage in Hoffman's model of the development of empathy occurs in late childhood. At this age, children can experience empathy in response to another person's life conditions, other than just that person's immediate circumstances. Their vicarious reactions can be produced by events that happened to the person before they met or will happen after the two part company. The ability to experience such feelings may even cause children to help or comfort someone whom they do not know well. Although Hoffman's model is widely accepted, it is based more on general theories of child development than on systematic observations of how infants actually behave. One of the more comprehensive attempts to directly examine empathy and prosocial behavior in infants and toddlers was carried out by Marian Rad-Yarrow and Carolyn Zan Waxler. Their work is important for two reasons. First, it provides some empirical tests of Hoffman's ideas, and second, it permits us to examine the interplay between inherited predispositions to be empathic and prosocial and the effects of parental behaviors and other learning experiences. Naturalistic observations of infants and toddlers. Rad-Yarrow, Zan Waxler, and their associates, 1984, studied empathy and prosocial behavior as children interact in their natural environment with their parents, playmates, and others. In contrast to the typical laboratory experiment, the children were observed in their own homes. To do this, these researchers enlisted the aid of the children's mothers, who were trained to systematically observe and tape record their children's reactions to distress in other people. Sometimes the distress the children saw was real. Sometimes the mothers simulated certain emotions. Within the real situations, the researchers examined those in which the children were merely innocent bystanders, and those in which they themselves were responsible for the other person's distress. Zan Waxler et al., 1992, studied a group of children at 3 different ages, 13 to 15 months, 18 to 20 months, and 23 to 25 months. So that's about a year old, a year and a half old, to 2 years old. The major question was whether the children's reactions to distress in others changed as they grew older. Although the researchers studied many reactions, we only discuss here empathy, which they defined as emotional arousal that appears to reflect sympathetic concern for the distressed person, and prosocial behavior, e.g., offering physical or verbal comfort, providing direct help, or sharing something of value. As Figure 2.3 shows, there were substantial changes in both empathy and prosocial behavior as the children matured. When the children were 13 to 15 months old, about a year, distress in others was unlikely to produce an empathic response. Less than 10% of the children showed empathy for a distressed person, even their mothers. Prosocial actions towards someone in distress were equally unlikely. However, by the time the children were 2 years old, about a quarter of them showed empathy for a distressed person, and almost half acted prosocially toward the person in distress, e.g., they hugged the distressed person or verbally comforted him or her. This increase in empathy and prosocial behavior occurred even when it was the child who had caused the other person's distress. We see a steady increase in empathy and helpfulness as children mature. Figure 2.3. Developmental trends in empathy and prosocial behavior both increase with age. Dan Waxler et al., 1992. So on the x-axis is age, and there's 3 categories: 13 to 15 months, 18 to 20 months, and 23 to 25 months old. So about a year and a half, and 2 years old. On the y-axis is percent of children showing empathy and acting prosocially from 0 to 50%. So at 13 to 15 months, about a year old, about 10% of children are either behaving with empathy or showing prosocial behavior. At about a year and a half, The number is the same for children showing empathy, about 10%, but the number of children showing prosocial behavior has increased to about 20%. And by 23 to 25 months, or about 2 years old, empathy has now increased to about 25%, and prosocial behavior has increased all the way to 50%. And these two numbers of 25 and 50% are up from 10% at a year old. So it seems like children's prosocial behavior develops more quickly and more robustly than empathy, and then empathy develops more slowly and not as much. Zan Waxler and Ratk Yarrow found this pattern of changes in several different studies, but they were quick to point out that within these developmental patterns, there were substantial differences among the children they studied. Some children were much more empathic and prosocial than others. How can these individual differences be explained? Are they due to inherited differences between the children, differences in their environments? As is true with any nature-nurture question, the answer is probably both. Empathy and regulating emotions. Nancy Eisenberg and her colleagues, 2003, proposed a model of how innate differences in parenting practice might interact to produce individual differences in empathy. These researchers believe that individual differences in empathy may in part be due to inherited differences in children's temperaments. Some children may be inherently more emotional and sensitive to the world around them than are others. These inherited differences predispose these children to react more emotionally when they see others in distress. However, the way in which parents respond to and deal with these innate emotional responses plays a critical role in the development of empathy and results in some children being more empathic than others. More specifically, these researchers believe that when more empathic children are very young, their mothers may reinforce the child's natural inclinations to experience strong emotions when they see someone else in distress. However, as the children get older, the mothers also teach them how to regulate their emotions and keep them under some control. Thus, the children's emotions do not become so overwhelming that they become more concerned with their own feelings than with the feelings of the person in distress. As a result, these children are predisposed to be empathic and helpful when they see someone in distress. Readiness to learn and empathy. The possibility that the way one is socialized can influence the development of empathy is consistent with studies that have demonstrated that it is possible, using the principles of classical conditioning, to teach children to respond empathically. Ehrenfried, 1970. But even these studies may need to be placed within a biological context. There is evidence from studies using both non-human and human species that show that it is easier to classically condition some responses than others. For example, it is easier to condition monkeys to fear pictures of snakes than pictures of flowers. 2001. Aumann and Dimberg, 1978, used human subjects and found it was easier to condition a physiological response to angry faces than to happy faces. Thus, there seems to be a genetically based readiness to learn to fear specific stimuli. Perhaps because of the evolutionary advantages altruism confers, children are also genetically predisposed to learn empathic responses and thus are more responsive to experiences that lead them to be prosocial. The answer, summary and implications. This chapter began with a simple question: is there a biological basis for prosocial actions among humans? That is, are humans naturally inclined to respond to the distress of others with positive emotions and a willingness to help? It turns out that this simple question, like a lot of simple questions, has a very complex answer. The major reason for this complexity is that it is impossible to neatly separate genetic influences on behavior from environmental ones. This is because each source of influence affects the other, and they work together to produce complex social behaviors, such as altruism. But with this important qualification in mind, we must conclude that there is a biological basis for prosocial actions in humans. The evidence in support of this conclusion comes from studies of cross-cultural and cross-species behaviors, research in behavioral genetics, and observations of newborn infants. Contemporary evolutionary theory, with its emphasis on genes as the key to evolutionary success, provides a very compelling argument that altruism may be essential to the survival of all animals, including humans. Processes such as kin selection in helping may have given an evolutionary advantage to those who were inclined to help close relatives, and reciprocal altruism may explain why prosocial actions directed at non-relatives may have yielded similar benefits. It does not appear likely that specific genes directly cause altruistic behaviors. Rather, genetic influences operate indirectly by giving people certain genetic propensities to act in certain ways and capacities, such as the ability to respond empathically and/or the ability to effectively understand the emotional states of other people. These tendencies to respond to the behaviors of others make it much more likely that altruistic behaviors will occur. There appears to be a natural predisposition to empathize with others in distress, but the responsivity can be moderated by learning experiences. Thus, although we conclude that at least some of people's willingness to offer help to others has a biological basis, we also recognize that such tendencies are the product of both nature and nurture, and that the two cannot be separated. In the next 2 chapters, we look at some of the specific variables that represent the environmental influences on one aspect of prosocial behavior, interpersonal helping. In Chapter 3, we ask the question, when will people help? And in Chapter 4, why do people help? In exploring these questions, we focus on more traditional psychological variables, situational factors, motivations, social norms, and culture.